I'll be talking indeed about the European data economy. My remarks actually link back to a number of the things that David Clark was saying just a moment ago, because a number of the problems that he was talking about are actually topics for current European legislation. As many of you will know, this is Digital Services Internet Month in Europe. We're expecting to see two major pieces of new legislation proposed by the European Commission on December 15th. There are lots of hints about what will be in them, but no firm knowledge. I thought that I would spend some of my talk today talking about a third piece of legislation that was already proposed on November 25th, and that actually addresses a number of the things that we talked about today, including the question that Georgios asked during the first panel about whether anybody is looking to improve data sharing. In any case, we've got a bunch of issues here, and I think that David Clark was quite right in saying a lot of these issues are going to be tricky and interesting and profound. So I'll be talking about the Data Governance Act. I'll be talking about its implications for international data flow and also the implications of recent court decisions in Europe, and providing some concluding thoughts. Now, I'll start with an analogy to real estate. And in real estate, it's often said that there are three things that matter. First and foremost is location. Then there's location, and last but not least, there's location. And I would argue that for digital services, there are likewise three things that matter: data, and not last but not least, data. So if data is so important, what can we do to make more data available? And this has been a concern for European policymakers. There was a strategy that was published in February of 2020. But I would argue that there's a long-standing tendency for European regulation to push in two somewhat opposite directions. You got the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which has come up frequently in our discussions today. It creates a pretty tight regime trying to protect privacy. I like the GDPR. I prefer it to the more fragmented approach taken in the USA, but it's a rather heavyweight approach. Many people would view it as the gold standard for privacy protection. I'm among them, but not to be forgotten is that among metals, gold is heavy, and it's also expensive. So I would argue that GDPR does have a tendency to increase transaction costs, especially when it comes to processing of personal data. Now, what most people miss is that at the same time that GDPR was coming into play in the same legislative term, other pieces of legislation were trying to make it easier to access non-personal data. Two pieces of legislation, one for general non-personal data, another for public sector information. So the one on free flow of non-personal data really tried to avoid the need for data localization, say that data could be processed any place in the European Union, tried to promote codes of conduct to facilitate switching among cloud services, and tried to clarify that whatever security requirements were in place from other bits of legislation should apply whether the data was stored in the country in question or else any place else in the EU or else in the cloud. So one fairly useful bit of legislation. Another piece, the Open Data Directive, again, a directive on public sector data, went beyond the previous standards, required, there was already a requirement for public sector agencies to make their data available as much as possible where there weren't any things that blocked it. Here, the revisions in 2019 extended those to public utilities, to transport, and to publicly funded research. Also tried to ensure that the cost couldn't be on the actual cost of the data, and in particular required the creation of real-time programming APIs for all of this public data. So you've got a real intent to open up the data for public use. Now, the Data Governance Act is new. It tries to build on that foundation. The problem tree that the Commission worked from, and recall that in Europe, legislation is proposed by the Commission, then gets voted on by the Parliament and the Council. So what the Commission was worried about was insufficient sharing of data, dependency on third countries, increasing consolidation of markets, low trust in data sharing. And so what they're trying to do with the legislation is to address those problems. and they did it in several different ways. The first piece relates again to public sector data. The previous legislation dealt only with the bits of public sector data that didn't have problems. Here they try to create some mechanism, even in cases where commercial confidentiality or statistical confidentiality, intellectual property, personal data, where they're involved, how much data could be shared and under what circumstances. They prohibit exclusive arrangements, and they empower agencies in each of the EU member states to do whatever they need to make this effective, which could be anonymizing or pseudonymizing data, could be requiring a secure environment, could be ensuring that confidentiality is preserved and that intellectual property rights are preserved, even if the data gets shared with a third country. And this comes back actually to the kind of extraterritoriality discussion that we had just a second ago with David Clark. And that also, of course, is very much a part of GDPR. A second thing they try to do is to create a possibility of private data sharing services. The idea is that there would be private companies, which don't have to be European companies. It could be American companies, could be Chinese companies, whatever. But they would be private data sharing services that provide intermediation for firm data and also for individual data for individuals who choose to make their personal data available. They were thinking here about people who might want to make their health data available for medical research, data cooperatives as well. But they're fairly heavy obligations that were laid on top of these providers to notify the member state authorities not to use the data for their own purposes. This comes back to some of the concerns about health data that Lillian Edwards had mentioned in her session earlier. Security, prevention of abuse, all told, though, a pretty heavy set of obligations, given that the thing is set up so that you don't really make much money on this. You can't integrate it with the rest of your business. I really question if companies are going to be so enthusiastic about doing this, but we'll see. A third area that they dealt with was something that they called data altruism. If you want to give away your data and share it with others, they wanted to make it easier to do that, easier to put in place voluntary sharing arrangements. They put in place a scheme for the European member countries, the member states, to recognize data altruism organizations. But to be one of these recognized data altruism organizations, you've got to be a nonprofit. You've got to be serving a public purpose. The data altruism has to be in a legally separate entity that can't be integrated with the for-profit activities, and you've got to be registered. And you've got to keep full records on the people who use the data, the firms, entities, whatever that use the data. So again, I mean, it sounds good, but I have my doubts as to how many firms will really choose to do this. Now, the key thing that the European institutions were trying to get to with this is to create so-called European data spaces. And here I think what they're trying to do is in the right direction. And they claim that the public consultation showed a lot of support for this. They're trying to create public data spaces for areas like health and environment, energy, agriculture, mobility, finance, manufacturing, public administration skills. Well, I would say it's a pretty good list. If they can actually get good data sharing in these areas, I can easily believe that there'll be gains. The act that was put in place is really creating the infrastructure. It doesn't create the data spaces. So what they were trying to do is produce mechanism here, not the data spaces themselves. Anytime that the Commission puts forward a proposed piece of legislation, they have to provide something called an impact assessment. This is actually fairly common in many countries. Basically, it's a projection of what the costs and benefits are of the proposed measure. And in this case, they quote some nice research from OECD that says that data sharing could produce gains as much as 1.5, 2.5% of GDP, maybe even more. These are actually pretty big numbers to an economist. A study that the Commission itself put out, which they haven't yet published, said that sharing of agricultural data could produce as much as 35 billion in savings, transport data as much as 40 billion, data on medications as much as 14. They don't say in what time frame. I would like to hope this is annual, but I have no idea. But again, it all sounds good. That's what you would get from an ideal sharing. How much of that do we really get out of what the Commission is proposing this year and next year? And I should add, by the way, the first of these data spaces is expected to be one on health. The legislative proposal for that will be fourth quarter of 2021. So it's going to be a while before we see this. Now, the biggest question to me is, are the companies really going to do this? Are they really going to share their data? The impact assessment that I mentioned a moment ago includes some data from an MIT Technology Review study, and it's a survey, and it looks pretty nice. It shows that the surveyed firms, a majority of them thought that they would get better speed and availability, better speed and visibility across their supply chains, faster and more innovative product development, and new and enhanced customer services. All good stuff. And you would think that that should be enough to promote sharing. For data, it's better to give than to receive, right? Right? Well, I'm actually not so sure that it's right. I think for data, it's probably better to receive than to give. I can very well see why a firm wants to receive data on the sectors in which they operate. It's less clear to me that they have incentives to give data, to provide the data. I can see a lot of risk of free riding problems where companies are happy to use data that others provide, but don't want to be bothered with providing it themselves or don't want to take on regulatory or other risks. So to me, there's an open question. I don't say this can't work, but I think until we have a much clearer view of what sectors it's applied to, what firms and what use cases, it's going to be unclear as to how well this would work. Okay, now what they didn't do, and rightly didn't do, they seem not to have produced new restrictions on free flow of data. They were trying to create new mechanisms to enable flow of data, not things to get in the way. And what we see from the senior folks that were responsible, Executive Vice President Vestager and also Commissioner Breton, who, by the way, spoke on a panel of mine just a week ago, they're making it very clear that they don't want to hinder data sharing. So as a goal, that's good. The impediments that we have to the flow of data, though, for personal data, are already there, and that's what I want to spend the rest of my time talking about. And these are the challenges to international flow of personal data. I think that David Clark quickly mentioned the Schrems decision, and that's a big deal. It was a decision of the Court of Justice of the European that was issued just in July of this year. It's actually a follow-up to an earlier judgment, and it undermines in important ways some of the main mechanisms that have been used to enable data transfer from the EU to the US and also to other third countries. Now, it can have a big effect. US, EU are huge trading partners. They're one another's biggest trading partners. And the transfers are important to US digital firms, which of course is the first thing that people think about. They're also hugely important to EU consumers that use those services, and also to many businesses both in the EU and the US. So what we have here is a potential impediment to data transfer. And the court, probably because they were frustrated about how little had happened with their previous judgment, didn't explicitly allow for a transition time. They actually require companies to take into account the government surveillance practices of the United States. One has to wonder how well equipped firms are to consider this. So the actual judgment was against Facebook, but I would have to say that the judgment represents a very heavy blow against the European Commission and a second heavy blow against the European Commission. In 2015, the court invalidated an earlier safe harbor agreement that made it easy to transfer data to the United States. The measures that were put in place here were a response to that judgment, didn't go far enough. This one's also invalidated. And in effect, the court said that the European Commission didn't do its homework. Now, let's talk a little about surveillance. And it may seem strange that we're talking here so much about government surveillance, but this ruling on a piece of privacy legislation was entirely about US government surveillance. It had nothing to do whatsoever with commercial privacy. So surveillance of communications, everybody recognizes that it's good, it's useful for criminal investigations, it's useful for national security. Nobody wants to get rid of it. But because there's a concern that it could be used to promote a police state that it represents a risk to privacy, to freedom of expression. Because of that, pretty much every free democratic society puts restrictions on it. And normally, the heart of those restrictions are that to surveil anybody, the responsible agency has to make a convincing showing to some independent judge, magistrate, whomever, that there's a reasonable ground for suspicion or reasonable ground to do it. Commercial privacy, very different from law enforcement, very different also from national security surveillance. In the case of law enforcement, the law enforcement agency wants to show that the data has been properly collected because they need to somehow show it to a judge if they're ever going to get a conviction for a crime. So there's pressure on them to do it right. The national security authorities never expect to show what they've collected. Therefore, there's very little pressure on them to follow even the directives of their own respective governments. Now, after the first decision, the EU and USA tried to solve the problem by agreeing a new framework called Privacy Shield. Everybody knew at the time it was a weak structure. It had some fairly good mechanisms for commercial privacy, which, however, had nothing to do with the court decision. As far as the surveillance, it's remarkable that anything at all was done. But what was done wasn't a treaty. Basically, it was a set of memoranda from U.S. government surveillance agencies to the U.S. Department of Commerce. They also created an ombudsperson without giving him or her a clear authority. So something was done. Was it enough? Well, according to the court, no. They argue that surveillance undertaken by the U.S. government is way over the top, and also that EU persons have no effective rights of redress in front of U.S. courts, partly also because this ombudsperson was insufficiently empowered. So that's not good. Again, this is all about government surveillance, nothing about commercial. So why do you suppose that the court was worried about government surveillance in the United States? Well, it has a lot to do with this guy, Edward Snowden. And what we all, of course, all know is that the various documents that he has produced, nobody really disputes that these are legitimate, show huge amounts of surveillance, including by most of the US-based platforms, including Facebook, which was actually the defendant in the Schrems case. So there we are. And wrapping up here, so where does this leave us? Well, first, I think the Commission is barking up the right tree in that they're properly investing efforts to try to improve data flows, data sharing, private, non-public data, and public sector data. Trying to extend that, I think this is a good thing to do. It's broadly in the right direction. How much it will actually accomplish, I think, is unclear, especially because it's not clear that it's possible to align the incentives correctly. These are multi-sided markets. The fact that the legislation insists mostly on a not-for-profit or no separate capitalization on the data approach, I think makes it very hard to monetize the things that they're trying to achieve and to incent the companies to do what's needed. But the good thing is it doesn't create new barriers to data flows. What we have is existing barriers that might be quite severe. Now, the Schrems II decision does represent a threat, and there's no clear solution to that yet. The best way to fix it by far would be a successor to the Privacy Shield Agreement that's institutionally well structured to the point where it can be judicially supported. That's the right answer. It obviously wasn't possible to have that discussion with the Trump administration. One can hopefully have a serious discussion with the Biden administration. I don't think it's an easy thing to do. Whether it's actually practical, I think, remains to be seen. I'm quite happy to see some pushback on U.S. surveillance. Many of you will know that I'm actually a witness against the U.S. NSA and the U.S. government from the George W. Bush years, based on disclosures from a previous whistleblower, one before Snowden. So I'm sort of happy to see that. But the risk to transatlantic commerce is substantial, and I think it's a genuine worry.